Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the continuing impact on the global economy on the war in Iran. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been discussing rising oil prices, disruption to shipping, attacks on energy infrastructure, and growing concerns about inflation. But the latest developments suggest that rather than moving towards a resolution, this conflict may actually be spreading. We've seen reports of strikes against Kuwait and Bahrain by Iran. We've seen further military action in and around the Strait of Hormuz, and we're continuing to see conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. We're seeing growing concerns over the safety of civilian aviation across the Middle East. We're seeing increasing confusion over whether peace talks are actually taking place. And we're seeing oil prices moving back towards $100 per barrel at a time when global inventories are under severe pressure. So in this video, I want to go through exactly what's happening right now, why it matters, and why the risks to the global economy may actually be increasing rather than decreasing. But before we get into all of those details, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscribe button? Really helps with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. And if you could also give me a thumbs up for this video, I'd really appreciate it. And don't forget that my competition, where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize, is now in the closing stages. So if you haven't bought a ticket yet and you want to get involved, now's the time to do it. So click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen now. Okay, one of the biggest concerns at the moment is that this conflict is no longer being confined just to Iran. We are seeing multiple fronts developing simultaneously. The USA and Iran continue to exchange military strikes. Israel and Hezbollah are clashing in Lebanon. Shipping remains under threat in and around the Strait of Hormuz, and now Gulf states that have remained largely on the sidelines are finding themselves drawn closer to this conflict. So let's start with Kuwait. The latest reports say that Iran has launched missiles and drones towards targets in Kuwait. Some of those attacks were directly towards facilities associated with American military operations. However, the attacks also had consequences for civilian infrastructure. Kuwait International Airport temporarily suspended operations and diverted flights whilst authorities addressed the situation. There were reports of casualties. At least one person was reported as having been killed, and damage. Now, regardless of the scale of the physical damage, the significance of this attack should not be underestimated. Kuwait International Airport is one of the key gateways into the Gulf region. And when airports are disrupted, the economic consequences spread very quickly. Flights are delayed, passengers are stranded, cargo movements are affected, business travel is disrupted, and costs increase throughout the whole system. At the same time, Bahrain also found itself in the firing line. Air defense systems were activated after missiles were reportedly launched towards the country. This is particularly significant because Bahrain hosts the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet. In other words, this is not some remote military outpost. It's one of the most strategically important American facilities in the region. And the fact that missiles are now reportedly being fired towards Bahrain demonstrates just how dangerous and unpredictable the situation has become. The response from neighbouring countries has been equally notable. The UAE has reportedly called on a more unified Gulf response, arguing that attacks against one Gulf state should be viewed as attacks against all of them. And that matters because the more Gulf countries that become involved, the greater the risk that this conflict broadens even further. And that increases the risk to oil production, energy exports, shipping routes, and overall regional stability. At the same time, the military exchanges between the USA and Iran are continuing. American forces have reportedly launched further strikes against Iranian military facilities following attacks linked to American assets in the region. Meanwhile, reports indicate that vessels operating in and around the Gulf continue to face elevated risks as both sides attempt to exert pressure on each other. And this is one of the reasons why markets remain so nervous, because every new incident increases the risk of miscalculation. And in a region that exports such a large proportion of the world's energy supplies, miscalculations can become very expensive. At the same time, fighting between Israel and Hezbollah continues in Lebanon. Despite repeated diplomatic efforts, ceasefire discussions have failed to bring lasting stability. Israeli strikes have continued against targets in southern Lebanon and around Beirut. Hezbollah has continued attacks of its own, and once again this highlights the fact that what began as a conflict in one country is increasingly becoming a series of interconnected conflicts. And that brings us to another issue that's receiving less attention but may prove extremely important: civil aviation. Lebanon has now launched a safety audit into Middle East airlines following concerns raised by pilot groups. The airline has been widely praised for maintaining services during a period when many international airlines have either reduced operations or avoided certain routes altogether. However, questions are now being asked about operational procedures and flight safety. And whilst the details remain disputed, the broader issue is crystal clear. Airlines operating in the region are facing enormous challenges. Aircraft are being forced to take longer routes, flights are avoiding certain airspace corridors, fuel consumption is increasing, scheduling is becoming more complex, insurance costs are rising, and operational risks are increasing. And all of those factors increase costs, and those costs eventually get passed on. Passengers pay more, freight operators pay more, businesses pay more, consumers pay more. This is one of the hidden costs of the war. Even countries thousands of miles away can feel the consequences through higher transportation costs and more expensive supply chains. And unfortunately, there is little evidence that a diplomatic breakthrough is imminent. Donald Trump has stated that discussions with Iran are continuing. However, Iranian officials have suggested that communication has stalled and that negotiations are not progressing. Whether those positions are genuine negotiating tactics or a reflection of reality is difficult to know. But what matters for markets is there appears to be little sign of a deal. And Marco Rubio has added further uncertainty. He's made it clear that sanctions relief is not simply linked to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, it remains tied to broader issues surrounding Iran's nuclear program and uranium enrichment. That means any agreement is likely to be complicated. It means negotiations could take considerably longer, and it means the market can't assume a resolution is just around the corner. Which brings us to the biggest issue of all: oil. Oil prices have once again moved back towards $100, and whilst many investors have become accustomed to elevated prices, the reality is that prolonged periods of high energy costs eventually have consequences. Oil has now spent around 3 months above $90 per barrel, compared with $60 at the start of this year. This is no longer a short-term spike. This is a sustained level of pressure, and sustained pressure eventually feeds through into the wider economy. Higher fuel costs increase transport costs, higher transport costs increase food prices, higher energy costs increase manufacturing costs, and eventually inflation begins to rise. That creates a major headache for central banks because central banks have spent the last few years trying to bring inflation under control. Now they face the prospect of energy-driven inflation returning at precisely the wrong moment. And there's another concern beginning to emerge. Executives from both ExxonMobil and Chevron have recently warned that inventories are becoming increasingly tight. The market has been relying on reserves and stockpiles to help absorb short supply disruptions. But those stockpiles cannot be drawn down forever. They will run out. Once inventories start becoming critically low, the market becomes much more vulnerable to any additional supply disruption. And that's where the warnings about $150 per barrel oil originate. Now, hopefully we won't get there, but if we do, the consequences will be significant. Gasoline prices will rise, diesel prices will shoot up, airfares would go sky high, shipping costs would rise, food prices would increase, and inflation would explode, and economic growth would come under further pressure. So whilst the headlines continue to focus on missiles and military operations, the bigger story may actually be the growing economic damage. This conflict is affecting airlines, airports, shipping, energy markets, and inflation, and there is still no clear indication as to when we're going to get an end to everything. The world wants stability, businesses want certainty, consumers want lower prices, but at the moment there is very little evidence that this situation is moving towards a quick resolution or any resolution. And that's why markets remain nervous and the impact on the global economy is getting worse. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you did like what I said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so.